The Call of the Canyon by Zane Grey. Chapter 1. What subtle strange message had come to her out of the west? Carley Burch laid the letter in her lap and gazed dreamily through the window. It was a day typical of early April in New York, rather cold and gray, with steely sunlight. Spring breathed in the air, but the women passing along 57th Street wore furs and wraps. She heard the distant clatter of an L train and then the hum of a motor car. A hurdy-gurdy jarred into the interval of quiet. Glenn has been gone over a year, she mused, 3 months over a year, and of all his strange letters this seems the strangest yet. She lived again, for the 1000th time, the last moments she had spent with him. It had been on New Year's Eve, 1918. They had called upon friends who were staying at the McAlpin in a suite on the 21st floor overlooking Broadway. And when the last quarter hour of that eventful and tragic year began slowly to pass with the low swell of whistles and bells, Carley's friends had discreetly left her alone with her lover at the open window to watch and hear the old year out, the new year in. Glenn Kilbourne had returned from France early that fall, shell-shocked and gassed, and otherwise incapacitated for service in the army, a wreck of his former sterling self and in many unaccountable ways a stranger to her. Cold, silent, haunted by something, he had made her miserable with his aloofness. But as the bells began to ring out the year that had been his ruin, Glenn had drawn her close, tenderly, passionately, and yet strangely, too. "Carley, look and listen," he had whispered. Under them stretched the great long white flare of Broadway, with its snow-covered length glittering under a myriad of electric lights. 6th Avenue swerved away to the right, a less brilliant lane of blanched snow. The L trains crept along like huge fire-eyed serpents. The hum of the ceaseless moving line of motor cars drifted upward faintly, almost drowned in the rising clamor of the street. Broadway's gay and thoughtless crowds surged to and fro, from that height merely a thick stream of black figures, like contending columns of ants on the march. And everywhere the monstrous electric signs flared up vivid in white and red and green, and dimmed and paled, only to flash up again. Ring out the old, ring in the new. Carley had poignantly felt the sadness of the one, the promise of the other. As one by one the siren factory whistles opened up with deep, hoarse bellow, the clamor of the street and the ringing of the bells were lost in a volume of continuous sound that swelled on high into a magnificent roar. It was the voice of a city, of a nation. It was the voice of a people crying out the strife and the agony of the year, pealing forth a prayer for the future. Glenn had put his lips to her ear. "It's like the voice in my soul." Never would she forget the shock of that. And how she had stood, spellbound, enveloped in the mighty volume of sound, no longer discordant, but full of great, pregnant melody, until the white ball burst upon the tower of the Times building, showing the bright figures. 1919. The new year had not been many minutes old when Glenn Kilbourne had told her he was going west to try to recover his health. Carley roused out of her memories to take up the letter that had so perplexed her. It bore the postmark, Flagstaff, Arizona. She reread it with slow pondering thoughtfulness. West Fork, March 25th. Dear Carley, it does seem my neglect in writing you is unpardonable. I used to be a pretty fair correspondent, but in that as in other things I have changed. One reason I have not answered sooner is because your letter was so sweet and loving that it made me feel an ungrateful and unappreciative wretch. Another is that this life I now lead does not induce writing. I am outdoors all day, and when I get back to this cabin at night I am too tired for anything but bed. Your imperious questions I must answer, and that must, of course, is a third reason why I have delayed my reply. First, you ask, don't you love me any more as you used to? Frankly, I do not. I am sure my old love for you, before I went to France, was selfish, thoughtless, sentimental, and boyish. I am a man now, and my love for you is different. Let me assure you that it has been about all left to me of what is noble and beautiful. Whatever the changes in me for the worse, my love for you, at least, has grown better, finer, purer. And now for your second question, are you coming home as soon as you are well again? Carley, I am well. I have delayed telling you this because I knew you would expect me to rush back east with the telling. But the fact is, Carley, I am not coming just yet. I wish it were possible for me to make you understand. For a long time I seem to have been frozen within. You know, when I came back from France I couldn't talk. It's almost as bad as that now. Yet all that I was then seems to have changed again. It is only fair to you to tell you that, as I feel now. I hate the city, I hate people, and particularly I hate that dancing, drinking, lounging set you chase with. I don't want to come east until I am over that, you know. Suppose I never get over it? Well, Carley, you can free yourself from me by one word that I could never utter. I could never break our engagement. During the hell I went through in the war, my attachment to you saved me from moral ruin, if it did not from perfect honor and fidelity. This is another thing I despair of making you understand. And in the chaos I've wandered through since the war, my love for you was my only anchor. You never guessed, did you, that I lived on your letters until I got well. And now the fact that I might get along without them is no discredit to their charm or to you. It is all so hard to put in words, Carley. To lie down with death and get up with death was nothing. To face one's degradation was nothing. But to come home an incomprehensibly changed man, and to see my old life as strange as if it were the new life of another planet, to try to slip into the old groove, well, no words of mine can tell you how utterly impossible it was. My old job was not open to me, even if I had been able to work. The government that I fought for left me to starve, or to die of my maladies. Like a dog, for all it cared. I could not live on your money, Carley. My people are poor, as you know. So there was nothing for me to do but to borrow a little money from my friends and to come west. I am glad I had the courage to come. What this west is I'll never try to tell you, because, loving the luxury and excitement and glitter of the city as you do, you'd think I was crazy. Getting on here, in my condition, was as hard as trench life. But now, Carley, something has come to me out of the west. That, too, I am unable to put into words. Maybe I can give you an inkling of it. I am strong enough to chop wood all day. No man or woman passes my cabin in a month. But I am never lonely. I love these vast red canyon walls towering above me. And the silence is so sweet. Think of the hellish din that filled my ears. Even now, sometimes, the brook here changes its babbling murmur to the roar of war. I never understood anything of the meaning of nature until I lived under these looming stone walls and whispering pines. So, Carley, try to understand me, or at least be kind. You know they came very near writing, "Gone West," after my name, and considering that this out west signifies for me a very fortunate difference. A tremendous difference. For the present I'll let well enough alone. Adios. Write soon. Love from Glenn. Carley's second reaction to the letter was a sudden upflashing desire to see her lover, to go out west and find him. Impulses with her were rather rare and inhibited, but this one made her tremble. If Glenn was well again, he must have vastly changed from the moody, stone-faced, and haunted-eyed man who had so worried and distressed her. He had embarrassed her, too, for sometimes, in her home, meeting young men there who had not gone into the service, he had seemed to retreat into himself, singularly aloof, as if his world was not theirs. Again, with eager eyes and quivering lips, she read the letter. It contained words that lifted her heart. Her starved love greedily absorbed them. In them she had excuse for any resolve that might bring Glenn closer to her. And she pondered over this longing to go to him. Carley had the means to come and go and live as she liked. She did not remember her father, who had died when she was a child. Her mother had left her in the care of a sister, and before the war they had divided their time between New York and Europe, the Adirondacks and Florida. Carley had gone in for Red Cross and relief work with more sincerity than most of her set. But she was really not used to making any decision as definite and important as that of going out west alone. She had never been farther west than Jersey City, and her conception of the West was a hazy one of vast plains and rough mountains, squalid towns, cattle herds, and uncouth ill-clad men. So she carried the letter to her aunt, a rather slight woman with a kindly face and shrewd eyes, and who appeared somewhat given to old-fashioned garments. "Aunt Mary, here's a letter from Glenn," said Carley. "It's more of a stumper than usual. Please read it." "Dear me, you look upset," replied the aunt, mildly, and, adjusting her spectacles, she took the letter. Carley waited impatiently for the perusal, conscious of inward forces coming more and more to the aid of her impulse to go west. Her aunt paused once to murmur how glad she was that Glenn had gotten well. Then she read on to the close. "Carley, that's a fine letter," she said, fervently. "Do you see through it?" "No, I don't," replied Carley. "That's why I asked you to read it. Do you still love Glenn as you used to before?" "Why, Aunt Mary," exclaimed Carley, in surprise. "Excuse me, Carley, if I am blunt. But the fact is young women of modern times are very different from my kind when I was a girl. You haven't acted as though you pined for Glenn. You get around almost the same as ever." "What is a girl to do?" protested Carley. "You are 26 years old, Carley," retorted Aunt Mary. "Suppose I am. I am as young as I ever was." "Well, let us not argue about modern girls and modern times. We never get anywhere," returned her aunt, kindly. "But I can tell you something of what Glenn Kilbourne means in that letter, if you want to hear it." "I do, indeed. The war did something horrible to Glenn aside from wrecking his health. Shell shock, they said. I don't understand that. Out of his mind, they said. But that never was true. Glenn was as sane as I am, and, my dear, that's pretty sane, I'll have you remember. But he must have suffered some terrible blight to his spirit, some blunting of his soul. 4 months after he returned he walked as one in a trance. Then came a change. He grew restless. Perhaps that change was for the better. At least, it showed he'd roused. Glenn saw you and your friends and the life you lead, and all the present, with eyes from which the scales had dropped. He saw what was wrong. He never said so to me, but I knew it. It wasn't he. Only to get well that he went west. It was to get away. And, Carley Burch, if your happiness depends on him, you had better be up and doing, or you'll lose him. Aunt Mary, gasped Carley. I mean it. That letter shows how near he came to the valley of the shadow, and how he has become a man. If I were you, I'd go out west. Surely there must be a place where it would be all right for you to stay. Oh, yes, replied Carley eagerly. Glenn wrote me there was a lodge where people went in nice weather, right down in the canyon, not far from his place. Then, of course, the town, Flagstaff, isn't far. Aunt Mary, I think I'll go. I would. You're certainly wasting your time here. But I could only go for a visit, rejoined Carley, thoughtfully. A month, perhaps 6 weeks, if I could stand it. Seems to me if you can stand New York, you could stand that place, said Aunt Mary, dryly. The idea of staying away from New York any length of time, why? I couldn't do it, but I can stay out there long enough to bring Glenn back with me. That may take you longer than you think, replied her aunt, with a gleam in her shrewd eyes. If you want my advice, you will surprise Glenn. Don't write him, don't give him a chance to suggest courteously that you'd better not come just yet. I don't like his words. Just yet. Auntie, you rather more than blunt, said Carley, divided between resentment and amaze. Glenn would be simply wild to have me come. Maybe he would. Has he ever asked you? No, come to think of it, he hasn't, replied Carley, reluctantly. Aunt Mary, you hurt my feelings. Well, child, I am glad to learn your feelings are hurt, returned the aunt. I am sure, Carley, that underneath all this blasé ultra something you've acquired, there's a real heart. Only you must hurry and listen to it, or what? Queried Carley. Aunt Mary shook her gray head sagely. Never mind what. Carley, I like your idea of the most significant thing in Glenn's letter. Why, his love for me, of course, replied Carley. Naturally you think that. But I don't. What struck me most were his words, out of the west. Carley, you do well to ponder over them. I will, rejoined Carley, positively. I'll do more. I'll go out to his wonderful west and see what he meant by them. Carley Burch possessed in full degree the prevailing modern craze for speed. She loved a motor car ride at 60 miles an hour along a smooth, straight road, or, better, on the level seashore of Ormond, where, on moonlight nights, the white blanched sand seemed to flash toward her. Therefore, quite to her taste was the 20th Century Limited, which was hurtling her on the way to Chicago. The unceasingly smooth and even rush of the train satisfied something in her. An old lady sitting in an adjoining seat with a companion amused Carley by the remark, I wish we didn't go so fast. People nowadays haven't time to draw a comfortable breath. Suppose we should run off the track? Carley had no fear of express trains, or motor cars, or transatlantic liners. In fact, she prided herself in not being afraid of anything. But she wondered if this was not the false courage of association with a crowd. Before this enterprise at hand she could not remember anything she had undertaken alone. Her thrills seemed to be in abeyance to the end of her journey. That night her sleep was permeated with the steady low whirring of the wheels. Once, roused by a jerk, she lay awake in the darkness while the thought came to her that she and all her fellow passengers were really at the mercy of the engineer. Who was he, and did he stand at his throttle keen and vigilant, thinking of the lives entrusted to him? Such thoughts vaguely annoyed Carley, and she dismissed them. A long half-day wait in Chicago was a tedious preliminary to the second part of her journey. But at last she found herself aboard the California Limited, and went to bed with a relief quite a stranger to her. The glare of the sun under the curtain awakened her. Propped up on her pillows, she looked out at apparently endless green fields or pastures, dotted now and then with little farmhouses and tree-skirted villages. This country, she thought, must be the prairie land she remembered lay west of the Mississippi. Later, in the dining car, the steward smilingly answered her question. This is Kansas, and those green fields out there are the wheat that feeds the nation. Carley was not impressed. The color of the short wheat appeared soft and rich, and the boundless fields stretched away monotonously. She had not known there was so much flat land in the world, and she imagined it might be a fine country for automobile roads. When she got back to her seat she drew the blinds down and read her magazines. Then, tiring of that, she went back to the observation car. Carley was accustomed to attracting attention, and did not resent it, unless she was annoyed. The train evidently had a full complement of passengers, who, as far as Carley could see, were people not of her station in life. The glare from the many windows, and the rather crass interest of several men, drove her back to her own section. There she discovered that someone had drawn up her window shades. Carley promptly pulled them down and settled herself comfortably. Then she heard a woman speak, not particularly low. I thought people traveled west to see the country. And a man replied, rather dryly, well, not always. His companion went on, if that girl was mine I'd let down her skirt. The man laughed and replied, Martha, you reach shore behind the times. Look at the pictures in the magazines. Such remarks amused Carley, and later she took advantage of an opportunity to notice her neighbors. They appeared a rather quaint old couple, reminding her of the natives of country towns in the Adirondacks. She was not amused, however, when another of her woman neighbors, speaking low, referred to her as a lunger. Carley appreciated the fact that she was pale, but she assured herself that there ended any possible resemblance she might have to a consumptive. And she was somewhat pleased to hear this woman's male companion forcibly voice her own convictions. In fact, he was nothing if not admiring. Kansas was interminably long to Carley, and she went to sleep before riding out of it. Next morning she found herself looking out at the rough gray and black land of New Mexico. She searched the horizon for mountains, but there did not appear to be any. She received a vague, slow dawning impression that was hard to define. She did not like the country, though that was not the impression which eluded her. Bare gray flats, low scrub-fringed hills, bleak cliffs, jumble after jumble of rocks, and occasionally a long vista down a valley, somehow compelling. These passed before her gaze until she tired of them. Where was the west? Glenn had written about. One thing seemed sure, and it was that every mile of this crude country brought her nearer to him. This recurring thought gave Carley all the pleasure she had felt so far in this endless ride. It struck her that England or France could be dropped down into New Mexico and scarcely noticed. By and by the sun grew hot, the train wound slowly and creakingly. Upgrade, the car became full of dust, all of which was disagreeable to Carley. She dozed on her pillow for hours, until she was stirred by a passenger crying out, delightedly, "Look! Indians!" Carley looked, not without interest. As a child she had read about Indians, and memory returned images both colorful and romantic. From the car window she espied dusty flat barrens, low squat mud houses, and queer-looking little people, children naked or extremely ragged and dirty, women in loose garments with flares of red, and men in white man's garb, slovenly and motley. All these strange individuals stared apathetically as the train slowly passed. "Indians," muttered Carley, incredulously. "Well, if they are the noble red people, my illusions are dispelled." She did not look out of the window again, not even when the brakeman called out the remarkable name of Albuquerque. Next day Carley's languid attention quickened to the name of Arizona, and to the frowning red walls of rock, and to the vast rolling stretches of cedar-dotted land. Nevertheless, it affronted her. This was no country for people to live in, and so far as she could see it was indeed uninhabited. Her sensations were not, however, limited to sight. She became aware of unfamiliar, disturbing little shocks or vibrations in her eardrums, and after that a disagreeable bleeding of the nose. The porter told her this was owing to the altitude. Thus, one thing and another kept Carley most of the time away from the window, so that she really saw very little of the country. From what she had seen she drew the conviction that she had not missed much. At sunset she deliberately gazed out to discover what an Arizona sunset was like, just a pale yellow flare. She had seen better than that above the Palisades. Not until reaching Winslow did she realize how near she was to her journey's end, and that she would arrive at Flagstaff after dark. She grew conscious of nervousness. Suppose Flagstaff were like these other queer little towns? Not only once, but several times before the train slowed down for her destination did Carley wish she had sent Glenn word to meet her. And when, presently, she found herself standing out in the dark, cold, windy night before a dim-lit railroad station, she more than regretted her decision to surprise Glenn. But that was too late, and she must make the best of her poor judgment. Men were passing to and fro on the platform, some of whom appeared to be very dark of skin and eye, and were probably Mexicans. At length an expressman approached Carley, soliciting patronage. He took her bags and, depositing them in a wagon, he pointed up the wide street, 1 block up and turn. Hotel Weatherford. Then he drove off. Carley followed, carrying her small satchel. A cold wind, driving the dust, stung her face as she crossed the street to a high sidewalk that extended along the block. There were lights in the stores and on the corners, yet she seemed impressed by a dark, cold, windy bigness. Many people, mostly men, were passing up and down, and there were motor cars everywhere. No one paid any attention to her. Gaining the corner of the block, she turned, and was relieved to see the hotel sign. As she Entered the lobby a clicking of pool balls and the discordant rasp of a phonograph assailed her ears. The expressman set down her bags and left. Carley standing there. The clerk or proprietor was talking from behind his desk to several men, and there were loungers in the lobby. The air was thick with tobacco smoke. No one paid any attention to Carley until, at length, she stepped up to the desk and interrupted the conversation. "Is this a hotel?" she queried, brusquely. The shirt-sleeved individual leisurely turned and replied, "Yes, ma'am." And Carley said, "No one would recognize it by the courtesy shown. I have been standing here waiting to register." With the same leisurely case and a cool, laconic stare, the clerk turned the book toward her. "Reckon people round here ask for what they want."
Carley made no further comment. She assuredly recognized that what she had been accustomed to could not be expected out here. What she most wished to do at the moment was to get close to the big open grate where a cheery red and gold fire cracked. It was necessary, however, to follow the clerk. He assigned her to a small drab room which contained a bed, a bureau, and a stationary washstand with one spigot. There was also a chair. While Carley removed her coat and hat, the clerk went downstairs for the rest of her luggage. Upon his return, Carley learned that a stage left the hotel for Oak Creek Canyon at 9 o'clock next morning, and this cheered her so much that she faced the strange sense of loneliness and discomfort with something of fortitude. There was no heat in the room and no hot water. When Carley squeezed the spigot handle, there burst forth a torrent of water that spouted up out of the wash basin to deluge her. It was colder than any ice water she had ever felt. It was piercingly cold. Hard upon the surprise and shock, Carley suffered a flash of temper. But then the humor of it struck her and she had to laugh. "Serves you right, you spoiled doll of luxury," she mocked. "This is out west. Shiver and wait on yourself." Never before had she undressed so swiftly nor felt grateful for thick woolen blankets on a hard bed. Gradually she grew warm. The blackness, too, seemed rather comforting. "I am only 20 miles from Glenn," she whispered. "How strange. I wonder will he be glad." She felt a sweet, glowing assurance of that. Sleep did not come readily. Excitement had laid hold of her nerves, and for a long time she lay awake. After a while, the chug of motor cars, the click of pool balls, the murmur of low voices all ceased. Then she heard a sound of wind outside, an intermittent, low moaning, new to her ears, and somehow pleasant. Another sound greeted her, the musical clanging of a clock that struck the quarters of the hour. Some time late, sleep claimed her. Upon awakening, she found she had overslept, necessitating haste upon her part. As to that, the temperature of the room did not admit of leisurely dressing. She had no adequate name for the feeling of the water, and her fingers grew so numb that she made what she considered a disgraceful matter of her attire. Downstairs in the lobby, another cheerful red fire burned in the grate. How perfectly satisfying was an open fireplace! She thrust her numb hands almost into the blaze and simply shook with the tingling pain that slowly warmed out of them. The lobby was deserted. A sign directed her to a dining room in the basement, where of the ham and eggs and strong coffee she managed to partake a little. Then she went upstairs into the lobby and out into the street. A cold, piercing air seemed to blow right through her. Walking to the near corner, she paused to look around. Down the main street flowed a leisurely stream of pedestrians, horses, cars, extending between two blocks of low buildings. Across from where she stood lay a vacant lot, beyond which began a line of neat, oddly constructed houses, evidently residences of the town. And then, lifting her gaze, instinctively drawn by something obstructing the skyline, she was suddenly struck with surprise and delight. "Oh, how perfectly splendid!" she burst out. Two magnificent mountains loomed right over her, sloping up with majestic sweep of green and black timber to a ragged tree-fringed snow area that swept up cleaner and whiter, at last to lift pure glistening peaks, noble and sharp, and sunrise flushed against the blue. Carley had climbed Mont Blanc and she had seen the Matterhorn, but they had never struck such amaze and admiration from her as these twin peaks of her native land. "What mountains are those?" she asked a passerby. "San Francisco peaks, ma'am," replied the man. "Why, they can be over a mile away," she said. 18 miles, ma'am, he returned, with a grin. "Sure this Arizona air is deceivin'." "How strange," murmured Carley. "It's not that way in the Adirondacks." She was still gazing upward when a man approached her and said the stage for Oak Creek Canyon would soon be ready to start, and he wanted to know if her baggage was ready. Carley hurried back to her room to pack. She had expected the stage would be a motor bus or at least a large touring car, but it turned out to be a two-seated vehicle drawn by a team of ragged horses. The driver was a little wizen-faced man of doubtful years, and he did not appear obviously susceptible to the importance of his passenger. There was considerable freight to be hauled, besides Carley's luggage, but evidently she was the only passenger. "Reckon it's going to be a bad day," said the driver. "These April days high up on the desert are windy and cold. Mebit LL snow, too. Them clouds hangin' around the peaks ain't very promisin'. Now, miss, haven't you a heavier coat or something?" "No, I have not," replied Carley. "I'll have to stand it." "Did you say this was desert?" "I sure did." "Wall, there's a hoss blanket under the seat, and you can have that," he replied, and, climbing to the seat in front of Carley, he took up the reins and started the horses off at a trot. At the first turning, Carley became specifically acquainted with the driver's meaning of a bad day. A gust of wind, raw and penetrating, laden with dust and stinging sand, swept full in her face. It came so suddenly that she was scarcely quick enough to close her eyes. It took considerable clumsy effort on her part, with a handkerchief, aided by relieving tears, to clear her sight again. Thus uncomfortably Carley found herself launched on the last lap of her journey. All before her and alongside lay the squalid environs of the town. Looked back at, with the peaks rising behind, it was not unpicturesque. But the hard road with its sheets of flying dust, the bleak railroad yards, the round pens she took for cattle corrals, and the sordid debris littering the approach to a huge sawmill, these were offensive in Carley's sight. From a tall dome-like stack rose a yellowish smoke that spread overhead, adding to the lowering aspect of the sky. Beyond the sawmill extended the open country, sloping somewhat roughly, and evidently once a forest, but now a hideous bare slash, with ghastly burned stems of tree still standing and myriads of stumps attesting to denudation. The bleak road wound away to the southwest, and from this direction came the gusty wind. It did not blow regularly so that Carley could be on her guard. It lulled now and then, permitting her to look about, and then suddenly again whipping dust into her face. The smell of the dust was as unpleasant as the sting. It made her nostrils smart. It was penetrating, and a little more of it would have been suffocating. And as a leaden gray bank of broken clouds rolled up, the wind grew stronger and the air colder. Chilled before, Carley now became thoroughly cold. There appeared to be no end to the devastated forest land, and the farther she rode, the more barren and sordid grew the landscape. Carley forgot about the impressive mountains behind her, and as the ride wore into hours, such was her discomfort and disillusion that she forgot about Glenn Kilbourne. She did not reach the point of regretting her adventure, but she grew mightily unhappy. Now and then she espied dilapidated log cabins and surroundings even more squalid than the ruined forest. What wretched abodes! Could it be possible that people had lived in them? She imagined men had but hardly women and children. Somewhere she had forgotten an idea that women and children were extremely scarce in the West.
Straggling bits of forest, yellow pines, the driver called the trees, began to encroach upon the burned-over and arid barren land. To Carley, these groves, by reason of contrast and proof of what once was, only rendered the landscape more forlorn and dreary. Why had these miles and miles of forest been cut? By money grubbers, she supposed, the same as were devastating the Adirondacks. Presently, when the driver had to halt to repair or adjust something wrong with the harness, Carley was grateful for respite from cold inaction. She got out and walked. Sleet began to fall, and when she resumed her seat in the vehicle she asked the driver for the blanket to cover her. The smell of this horse blanket was less endurable than the cold. Carley huddled down into a state of apathetic misery. Already she had enough of the West. But the sleet storm passed, the clouds broke, the sun shone through, greatly mitigating her discomfort. By and by the road led into a section of real forest, unspoiled in any degree. Carley saw large gray squirrels, with tufted ears and white bushy tails. Presently the driver pointed out a flock of huge birds, which Carley, on second glance, recognized as turkeys, only these were sleek and glossy, with flecks of bronze and black and white, quite different from turkeys back east. There must be a farm near, said Carley, gazing about. No, ma'am. Them is wild turkeys, replied the driver, and sure the best eatin' you ever had in your life. A little while afterwards, as they were emerging from the woodland into more denuded country, he pointed out to Carley a herd of gray, white-rumped animals that she took to be sheep. And them is antelope, he said. Once this desert was overrun by antelope. Then they nearly disappeared. And now they re-increasin' again. More barren country, more bad weather, and especially an exceedingly rough road reduced Carley to her former state of dejection. The jolting over roots and rocks and ruts was worse than uncomfortable. She had to hold onto the seat to keep from being thrown out. The horses did not appreciably change their gait for rough sections of the road. Then, a more severe jolt brought Carley's knee in violent contact with an iron bolt on the forward seat, and it hurt her so acutely that she had to bite her lips to keep from screaming. A smoother stretch of road did not come any too soon for her. It led into forest again, and Carley soon became aware that they had at last left the cut and burned-over district of timberland behind. A cold wind moaned through the treetops and set the drops of water pattering down upon her. It lashed her wet face. Carley closed her eyes and sagged in her seat, mostly oblivious to the passing scenery. The girls will never believe this of me, she soliloquized. And indeed she was amazed at herself. Then thought of Glenn strengthened her. It did not really matter what she suffered on the way to him. Only she was disgusted at her lack of stamina and her appalling sensitiveness to discomfort. Wall, higher Oak Creek Canyon, called the driver. Carley, rousing out of her weary preoccupation, opened her eyes to see that the driver had halted at a turn of the road, where apparently it descended a fearful declivity. The very forest-fringed earth seemed to have opened into a deep abyss, ribbed by red rock walls and choked by steep mats of green timber. The chasm was a V-shaped split and so deep that looking downward sent at once a chill and a shudder over Carley. At that point it appeared narrow and ended in a box. In the other direction, it widened and deepened and stretched farther on between tremendous walls of red, and split its winding floor of green with glimpses of a gleaming creek boulder-strewn and ridged by white rapids. A low mellow roar of rushing waters floated up to Carley's ears. What a wild, lonely, terrible place! Could Glenn possibly live down there in that ragged rent in the earth? It frightened her, the sheer sudden plunge of it from the heights. Far down the gorge a purple light shone on the forested floor. And on the moment the sun burst through the clouds and sent a golden blaze down into the depths, transforming them incalculably. The great cliffs turned gold, the creek changed to glancing silver, the green of trees vividly freshened, and in the clefts rays of sunlight burned into the blue shadows. Carley had never gazed upon a scene like this. Hostile and prejudiced, she had felt wrung from her an acknowledgment of beauty and grandeur. But wild, violent, savage, not livable. This insulated rift in the crust of the earth was a gigantic burrow for beasts, perhaps for outlawed men. Not for a civilized person, not for Glenn Kilbourne. "Don T.B. Scart, ma'am," spoke up the driver. "It is safe if you careful. And I drove this many's the time." Carley's heartbeats thumped at her side, rather denying her taunted assurance of fearlessness. Then the rickety vehicle started down at an angle that forced her to cling to her seat. Chapter 2. Carley, clutching her support, with a bated breath and prickling skin, gazed in fascinated suspense over the rim of the gorge. Sometimes the wheels on that side of the vehicle passed within a few inches of the edge. The brakes squeaked, the wheels slid, and she could hear the scrape of the iron-shod hoofs of the horses as they held back stiff-legged, obedient to the wary call of the driver. The first 100 yards of that steep road cut out of the cliff appeared to be the worst. It began to widen, with descents less precipitous. Tips of trees rose level with her gaze, obstructing sight of the blue depths. Then brush appeared on each side of the road. Gradually Carley's strain relaxed, and also the muscular contraction by which she had braced herself in the seat. The horses began to trot again. The wheels rattled. The road wound around abrupt corners, and soon the green and red wall of the opposite side of the canyon loomed close. Low roar of running water rose to Carley's ears. When at length she looked out, instead of down she could see nothing but a mass of green foliage, crossed by tree trunks and branches of brown and gray. Then the vehicle bowled under dark cool shade into a tunnel with mossy wet cliff on one side and close standing trees on the other. "Reckon we all right now, unless we meet somebody coming up," declared the driver. Carley relaxed. She drew a deep breath of relief. She had her first faint intimation that perhaps her extensive experience of motor cars, express trains, transatlantic liners, and even a little of airplanes, did not range over the whole of adventurous life. She was likely to meet something entirely new and striking out here in the West. The murmur of falling water sounded closer. Presently Carley saw that the road turned at the notch in the canyon and crossed a clear, swift stream. Here were huge mossy boulders and red walls covered by lichens, and the air appeared dim and moist and full of mellow, hollow roar. Beyond this crossing the road descended the west side of the canyon, drawing away and higher from the creek. Huge trees, the like of which Carley had never seen, began to stand majestically up out of the gorge, dwarfing the maples and white-spotted sycamores. The driver called these great trees yellow pines. At last the road led down from this steep slope to the floor of the canyon. What from far above had appeared only a green timber-choked Cleft proved from close relation to be a wide winding valley, tip and down, densely forested for the most part, yet having open glades and bisected from wall to wall by the creek. Every quarter of a mile or so the road crossed the stream, and at these fords Carley again held on desperately and gazed out dubiously, for the creek was deep, swift, and full of boulders. Neither driver nor horses appeared to mind obstacles. Carley was splashed and jolted not inconsiderably. They passed through groves of oak trees, from which the creek manifestly derived its name, and under gleaming walls, cold, wet, gloomy, and silent, and between lines of solemn wide-spreading pines. Carley saw deep, still green pools, eddying under a huge massed jumble of cliffs and stretches of white water, and then, high above the treetops, a wild line of canyon rim, cold against the sky. She felt shut in from the world, lost in an unscalable rut of the earth. Again the sunlight had failed, and the gray gloom of the canyon oppressed her. It struck Carley as singular that she could not help being affected by mere weather, mere heights and depths, mere rock walls and pine trees, and rushing water. For really, what had these to do with her? These were only physical things that she was passing. Nevertheless, although she resisted sensation, she was more and more shot through and through with the wildness and savageness of this canyon. A sharp turn of the road to the right disclosed a slope down the creek, across which showed orchards and fields, and a cottage nestling at the base of the wall. The ford at this crossing gave Carley more concern than any that had been passed, for there was greater volume and depth of water. One of the horses slipped on the rocks, plunged up and on with great splash. They crossed, however, without more mishap to Carley than further acquaintance with this iciest of waters. From this point the driver turned back along the creek, passed between orchards and fields, and drove along the base of the red wall to come suddenly upon a large rustic house that had been hidden from Carley's sight. It sat almost against the stone cliff, from which poured a white foamy sheet of water. The house was built of slabs with the bark on, and it had a lower and upper porch running all around, at least as far as the cliff. Green growths from the rock wall overhung the upper porch. A column of blue smoke curled lazily upward from a stone chimney. On one of the porch posts hung a sign with rude lettering, Laramie Lodge. "Hey, Josh, did you fetch the flour?" called a woman's voice from inside. "Hello, I reckon I didn't forget nothin'," replied the man, as he got down. "And say, Mrs. Hutter, hire a young lady from New York." That latter speech of the driver's brought Mrs. Hutter out on the porch. "Flo, come here," she called to someone evidently near at hand. And then she smilingly greeted Carley. "Get down and come in, miss," she said. "I am sure glad to see you." Carley, being stiff and cold, did not very gracefully disengage herself from the high muddy wheel and step. When she mounted to the porch, she saw that Mrs. Hutter was a woman of middle age, rather stout, with strong face full of fine wavy lines, and kind dark eyes. "I am Miss Burch," said Carley. "You re the girl whose picture Glenn Kilbourne has over his fireplace," declared the woman, heartily. "I am sure glad to meet you, and my daughter Flo will be, too." That about her picture pleased and warmed Carley. "Yes, I am Glenn Kilbourne's fiancée. I've come west to surprise him." "Is he here?" Is he well?" "Fine. I saw him yesterday. He has changed a great deal from what he was at first. Most all the last few months. I reckon you want know him. But you read wet and cold and you look faggied. Come right into the fire. Thank you, I am all right, returned Carley. At the doorway they encountered a girl of lithe and robust figure. Quick in her movements, Carley was swift to see the youth and grace of her, and then a face that struck Carley as neither pretty nor beautiful, but still wonderfully attractive. Flo, here is Miss Burch, burst out Mrs. Hutter, with cheerful importance. Glenn Kilbourne's girl come all the way from New York to surprise him. Oh, Carley, I am sure happy to meet you, said the girl, in a voice of slow drawling richness. I know you. Glenn has told me all about you. If this greeting, sweet and warm as it seemed, was a shock to Carley, she gave no sign. But as she murmured something in reply she looked with all a woman's keenness into the face before her. Flo Hutter had a fair skin generously freckled, a mouth and chin too firmly cut to suggest a softer feminine beauty, and eyes of clear light hazel, penetrating, frank, fearless. Her hair was very abundant, almost silver gold in color, and it was either rebellious or showed lack of care. Carley liked the girl's looks, and liked the sincerity of her greeting, but instinctively she reacted antagonistically because of the frank suggestion of intimacy with Glenn. But for that she would have been spontaneous and friendly rather than restrained. They ushered Carley into a big living room and up to a fire of blazing logs, where they helped divest her of the wet wraps. And all the time they talked in the solicitous way natural to women who were kind and unused to many visitors. Then Mrs. Hutter bustled off to make a cup of hot coffee while Flo talked. We'll sure give you the nicest room, with a sleeping porch right under the cliff where the water falls. It'll sing you to sleep. Of course you needn't use the bed outdoors until it's warmer. Spring is late here, you? No, and we'll have nasty weather yet. You really happened on Oak Creek at its least attractive season. But then it's always, well, just Oak Creek. You'll come to know. I dare say I'll remember my first sight of it and the ride down that cliff road, said Carley, with a wan smile. Oh, that's nothing to what you'll see and do, returned Flo knowingly. We've had Eastern tenderfeet here before, and never was there one of them who didn't come to love Arizona tenderfoot. It hadn't occurred to me. But of course, murmured Carley. Then Mrs. Hutter returned, carrying a tray, which she set upon a chair, and drew to Carley's side. Eat and drink, she said, as if these actions were the cardinally important ones of life. Flo, you carry her bags up to that west room we always give to some particular person we want to love Lalami. Next she threw sticks of wood upon the fire, making it crackle and blaze, then seated herself near Carley and beamed upon her. You'll not mind if we call you Carley? She asked, eagerly. Oh, indeed no. I do like it, returned Carley, made to feel friendly and at home in spite of herself. You see it's not as if you were just a stranger, went on Mrs. Hutter. Tom, that's Flo's father, took a liking to Glenn Kilbourne when he first came to Oak Creek over a year ago. I wonder if you all know how sick that soldier boy was. Well, he lay on his back for 2 solid weeks, in the room we re-given you. And I for one didn't think he'd ever get up. But he did. And he got better. and after a while he went to work for Tom. Then 6 months and more ago he invested in the sheep business with Tom. He lived with us until he built his cabin up west Fork. He and Flo have run together a good deal, and naturally he told her about you. So you see, we're not a stranger. And we want you to feel you with friends. I thank you, Mrs. Hutter, replied Carley, feelingly. I never could thank you enough for being good to Glenn. I did not know he was so sick. At first he wrote, but seldom. Reckon he never wrote you or told you what he did in the war, declared Mrs. Hutter. Indeed he never did. Well, I'll tell you some day. For Tom found out all about him. Some of it from a soldier who came to Flagstaff for lung trouble. He'd been in the same company with Glenn. We didn't know this boy's name while he was in Flagstaff. But later Tom found out. John Henderson. He was only 22, a fine lad. And he died in Phoenix. We tried to get him out here, but the boy wouldn't live on charity. He was always expecting money, a war bonus, whatever that was. It didn't come. He was a clerk at the El Tovar for a while. Then he came to Flagstaff. But it was too cold and he stayed there too long. Too bad, rejoined Carley, thoughtfully. This information as to the suffering of American soldiers had augmented during the last few months, and seemed to possess strange, poignant power to depress Carley. Always she had turned away from the unpleasant, and the misery of unfortunates was as disturbing almost as direct contact with disease and squalor. But it had begun to dawn upon Carley that there might occur circumstances of life, in every way affronting her comfort and happiness, which it would be impossible to turn her back upon. At this juncture Flo returned to the room, and again Carley was struck with the girl's singular freedom of movement and the sense of sure poise and joy that seemed to emanate from her presence. "I've made a fire in your little stove," she said. "There's water heating. Now until you come up and change those traveling clothes. You'll want to fix up for Glenn, won't you?" Carley had to smile at that. This girl indeed was frank and unsophisticated, and somehow refreshing. Carley rose. "You are both very good to receive me as a friend," she said. "I hope I shall not disappoint you. Yes, I do want to improve my appearance before Glenn sees me. Is there any way I can send word to him, by someone who has not seen me?" "There sure is. I'll send Charlie, one of our hired boys." "Thank you. Then tell him to say there is a lady here from New York to see him, and it is very important." Flo Hutter clapped her hands and laughed with glee. Her gladness gave Carley a little twinge of conscience. Jealousy was an unjust and stifling thing. Carley was conducted up a broad stairway and along a boarded hallway to a room that opened out on the porch. A steady low murmur of falling water assailed her ears. Through the open door she saw across the porch to a white tumbling lacy veil of water falling, leaping, changing, so close that it seemed to touch the heavy pole railing of the porch. This room resembled a tent. The sides were of canvas. It had no ceiling, but the rough-hewn shingles of the roof of the house sloped down closely. The furniture was homemade. An Indian rug covered the floor. The bed with its woolly clean blankets and the white pillows looked inviting. "Is this where Glenn lay when he was sick?" queried Carley. "Yes," replied Flo, gravely, and a shadow darkened her eyes. I ought to tell you all about it. I will some day. But you must not be made unhappy now. Glenn nearly died here. Mother or I never left his side. For a while there, when life was so bad. She showed Carley how to open the little stove and put the short billets of wood inside and work the damper, and cautioning her to keep an eye on it so that it would not get too hot, she left Carley to herself. Carley found herself in an unfamiliar mood. There came a leap of her heart every time she thought of the meeting with Glenn, so soon now to be, but it was not that which was unfamiliar. She seemed to have a difficult approach to undefined and unusual thoughts. All this was so different from her regular life. Besides, she was tired. But these explanations did not suffice. There was a pang in her breast which must owe its origin to the fact that Glenn Kilbourne had been ill in this little room and some other girl than Carley Burch had nursed him. Am I jealous? She whispered. No. But she knew in her heart that she lied. A woman could no more help being jealous under such circumstances than she could help the beat and throb of her blood. Nevertheless, Carley was glad Flo Hutter had been there, and always she would be grateful to her for that kindness. Carley disrobed and, donning her dressing gown, she unpacked her bags and hung her things upon pegs under the curtain shelves. Then she lay down to rest, with no intention of slumber. But there was a strange magic in the fragrance of the room, like the piney tang outdoors, and in the feel of the bed, and especially in the low, dreamy hum and murmur of the waterfall. She fell asleep. When she awakened it was 5 o'clock. The fire in the stove was out, but the water was still warm. She bathed and dressed, not without care, yet as swiftly as was her habit at home, and she wore white because Glenn had always liked her best in white. But it was assuredly not a gown to wear in a country house where draughts of cold air filled the unheated rooms and halls. So she threw round her a warm sweater shawl, with colorful bars becoming to her dark eyes and hair. All the time that she dressed and thought, her very being seemed to be permeated by that soft murmuring sound of falling water. No moment of waking life there at Lalamy Lodge, or perhaps of slumber hours, could be wholly free of that sound. It vaguely tormented Carley, yet was not uncomfortable. She went out upon the porch. The small alcove space held a bed and a rustic chair. Above her the peeled poles of the roof descended to within a few feet of her head. She had to lean over the rail of the porch to look up. The green and red rock wall sheered ponderously near. The waterfall showed first at the notch of a fissure, where the cliff split, and down over smooth places the water gleamed, to narrow in a crack with little drops, and suddenly to leap into a thin white sheet. Out from the porch the view was restricted to glimpses between the pines, and beyond to the opposite wall of the canyon. How shut in, how walled in this home. In summer it might be good to spend a couple of weeks here, soliloquized Carley. But to live here? Heavens! A person might as well be buried. Heavy footsteps upon the porch below, accompanied by a man's voice, quickened Carley's pulse. Did they belong to Glenn? After a strained second she decided not. Nevertheless, the acceleration of her blood and an unwanted glow of excitement, long a stranger to her, persisted as she left the porch and entered the boarded hall. How gray and barn-like this upper part of the house! From the head of the stairway, However, the big living room presented a cheerful contrast. There were warm colors, some comfortable rockers, a lamp that shed a bright light, and an open fire which alone would have dispelled the raw gloom of the day. A large man in corduroys and top boots advanced to meet Carley. He had a clean-shaven face that might have been hard and stern but for his smile, and one look into his eyes revealed their resemblance to Flo's. "I am Tom Hutter, and I am sure glad to welcome you to Lalamy, Miss Carley," he said. His voice was deep and slow. There were ease and force in his presence, and the grip he gave Carley's hand was that of a man who made no distinction in handshaking. Carley, quick in her perceptions, instantly liked him and sensed in him a strong personality. She greeted him in turn and expressed her thanks for his goodness to Glenn. Naturally, Carley expected him to say something about her fiancé, but he did not. "Well, Miss Carley, if you don't mind, I'll say you re prettier than your picture," said Hutter. "And that is sure sayin' a lot. All the sheep herders in the country have taken a peep at your picture. Without permission, you understand." "I am greatly flattered," laughed Carley. "We re glad you've come," replied Hutter, simply. "I just got back from the East myself. Chicago and Kansas City. I came to Arizona from Illinois over 30 years ago, and this was my first trip since. Reckon I've not got back my breath yet. Times have changed, Miss Carley. Times and people." Mrs. Hutter bustled in from the kitchen, where manifestly she had been importantly engaged. "For the land's sakes," she exclaimed fervently as she threw up her hands at sight of Carley. Her expression was indeed a compliment, but there was a suggestion of shock in it. Then Flo came in. She wore a simple gray gown that reached the top of her high shoes. "Carley, don't mind mother," said Flo. "She means your dress is lovely. Which is my say, too. But, listen. I just saw Glenn coming up the road." Carley ran to the open door with more haste than dignity. She saw a tall man striding along. Something about him appeared familiar. It was his walk, an erect, swift carriage, with a swing of the march still visible. She recognized Glenn, and all within her seemed to become unstable. She watched him cross the road, face the house. How changed! No, this was not Glenn Kilbourne. This was a bronzed man, wide of shoulder, roughly garbed, heavy-limbed, quite different from the Glenn she remembered. He mounted the porch steps, and Carley, still unseen herself, saw his face. Yes, Glenn. Hot blood seemed to be tingling, liberated in her veins. Wheeling away, she backed against the wall behind the door and held up a warning finger to Flo, who stood nearest. Strange and disturbing then, to see something in Flo Hutter's eyes that could be read by a woman in only one way. A tall form darkened the doorway. It strode in and halted. "Flo, where," he began, breathlessly. His voice, so well remembered, yet deeper, huskier, fell upon Carley's ears as something unconsciously longed for. His frame had so filled out that she did not recognize it. His face, too, had unbelievably changed, not in the regularity of feature that had been its chief charm, but in contour of cheek and vanishing of pallid hue and tragic line. Carley's heart swelled with joy. Beyond all else she had hoped to see the sad fixed hopelessness, the havoc, gone from his face. Therefore the restraint and nonchalance upon which Carley prided herself sustained. Eclipse. Glenn! Look, who is here? She called, in voice she could not have steadied to save her life. This meeting was more than she had anticipated. Glenn whirled with an inarticulate cry. He saw Carley. Then, no matter how unreasonable or exacting had been Carley's longings, they were satisfied. You, he cried, and leaped at her with radiant face. Carley not only did not care about the spectators of this meeting, but forgot them utterly. More than the joy of seeing Glenn, more than the all-satisfying assurance to her woman's heart that she was still beloved, welled up a deep, strange, profound something that shook her to her depths. It was beyond selfishness. It was gratitude to God and to the West that had restored him. Carley! I couldn't believe it was you, he declared, releasing her from his close embrace, yet still holding her. Yes, Glenn, it is all you've left of me, she replied, tremulously. And she sought with unsteady hands to put up her disheveled hair. You big sheep herder! You Goliath! I never was so knocked off my pins, he said. A lady to see me from New York. Of course it had to be you. But I couldn't believe. Carley, you were good to come. Somehow the soft, warm look of his dark eyes hurt her. New and strange indeed it was to her, as were other things about him. Why had she not come west sooner? She disengaged herself from his hold and moved away, striving for the composure habitual with her. Flo Hutter was standing before the fire, looking down. Mrs. Hutter beamed upon Carley. Now let us have supper, she said. Reckon Miss Carley can tea now, after that hug Glenn gave her, drawled Tom Hutter. I was some worried. You see Glenn has gained 70 pounds in 6 months. And he doesn't know his strength. 70 pounds, exclaimed Carley, gaily. I thought it was more. Carley, you must excuse my violence, said Glenn. I've been hugging sheep. That is, when I shear a sheep I have to hold him. They all laughed, and so the moment of readjustment passed. Presently Carley found herself sitting at table, directly across from Flo. A pearly whiteness was slowly warming out of the girl's face. Her frank, clear eyes met Carley's and they had nothing to hide. Carley's first requisite for character in a woman was that she be a thoroughbred. She lacked it often enough herself to admire it greatly in another woman, and that moment saw a birth of respect and sincere liking in her for this Western girl. If Flo Hutter ever was a rival she would be an honest one. Not long after supper Tom Hutter winked at Carley and said he reckoned on general principles it was his hunch to go to bed. Mrs. Hutter suddenly discovered tasks to perform elsewhere, and Flo set in. Her cool sweet drawl, somehow audacious and tantalizing, sure you two will want a spoon. Now, Flo, Eastern girls are no longer old-fashioned enough for that, declared Glenn. Too bad. Reckon I can see how love could ever be old-fashioned. Good night, Glenn. Good night, Carley. Flo stood an instant at the foot of the dark stairway where the light from the lamp fell upon her face. It seemed sweet and earnest to Carley. It expressed unconscious longing, but no envy. Then she ran up the stairs to disappear. Glenn, is that girl in love with you? Asked Carley, bluntly. To her amaze, Glenn laughed. When had she heard him laugh? It thrilled her, yet nettled her a little. If that isn't like you, he ejaculated. Your very first words after we are left alone. It brings back the East, Carley. Probably recall to memory will be good for you, returned Carley. But tell me, is she in love with you? Why, no, certainly not, replied Glenn. Anyway, how could I answer such a question? It just made me laugh, that is all. Humph. I can remember when you were not above making love to a pretty girl. You certainly had me worn to a frazzle before we became engaged, said Carley. Old times. How long ago they seem. Carley, it is sure wonderful to see you. How do you like my gown? Asked Carley, pirouetting for his benefit. Well, what little there is of it is beautiful, he replied, with a slow smile. I always liked you best in white. Did you remember? Yes. I got the gown for you. And I'll never wear it except for you. Same old coquette, same old eternal feminine, he said, half sadly. You know when you look stunning. But, Carley, the cut of that, or rather the abbreviation of it, inclines me to think that style for women's clothes has not changed for the better. In fact, it is worse than 2 years ago in Paris and later in New York. Where will you women draw the line? Women are slaves to the prevailing mode, rejoined Carley. I don't imagine women who dress would ever draw a line if fashion went on dictating. But would they care so much if they had to work, plenty of work, and children? Inquired Glenn, wistfully. Glenn! Work and children for modern women? Why, you are dreaming, said Carley, with a laugh. She saw him gaze thoughtfully into the glowing embers of the fire, and as she watched him her quick intuition grasped a subtle change in his mood. It brought a sternness to his face. She could hardly realize she was looking at the Glenn Kilbourne of old. Come close to the fire, he said, and pulled up a chair for her. Then he threw more wood upon the red coals. You must be careful not to catch cold out here. The altitude makes a cold dangerous. And that gown is no protection. Glenn, 1 chair used to be enough for us, she said, archly, standing beside him. But he did not respond to her hint, and, a little affronted, she accepted the proffered chair. Then he began to ask questions rapidly. He was eager for news from home, from his people, from old friends. However, he did not inquire of Carley about her friends. She talked unremittingly for an hour, before she satisfied his hunger. But when her turn came to ask questions she found him reticent. He had fallen upon rather hard days at first out here in the West, then his health had begun to improve, and as soon as he was able to work his condition rapidly changed for the better, and now he was getting along pretty well. Carley felt hurt at his apparent disinclination to confide in her. The strong cast of his face, as if it had been chiseled in bronze, the stern set of his lips and the jaw that protruded lean and square-cut, the quiet masked light of his eyes, the coarse roughness of his brown hands, mute evidence of strenuous labors, these all gave a different impression from his brief remarks about himself. Lastly, there was a little gray in the light brown hair over his temples. Glenn was only 27, yet he looked 10 years older.